Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with an absolutely fabulous list of 16 amazing Symphonies number 3, the third symphonies of a whole bunch of great composers. Now, I do want to make a little qualification in light of the brouhaha that sort of erupted after the list of Symphonies numbers 2. This is just a list of 16 great third symphonies. It is not the list of all great third symphonies. You obviously will have some choice of things that aren't on the list, but here's the point. The fact that something is not on the list does not suggest that it's worse or didn't deserve to be there, nor does it suggest that for some reason there should only be a list of 16 and the things that aren't on the list that have to be on the list and should be on the list that aren't on the list should create an existential crisis. The only work that I really sort of missed from Symphony number 2, I think, was the Borodin Second Symphony. That should have been there. And the reason it should have been there, I thought, although I don't know what it would have replaced, we would have had to do 17 pieces. But the reason I think it should have been there is because it was the greatest symphony of a composer who otherwise would not have been represented on any list. And one of the purposes of doing these lists is to cover as much repertoire as possible. Therefore, if there are some composers who wrote a bunch of symphonies and they might all be great, such as Brahms, for example, I don't feel any need to mention all of them, because if you mention 2 or 3 of them, you're covered. You're more than well covered. And the fact that the Brahms Second Symphony wasn't on the list doesn't mean there's anything wrong with Brahms' Second Symphony. It just wasn't on the list. And it's okay, because we're not limited to 16. You're not limited to 16. This is simply a list for people to look and enjoy and sample and try out. And if you have other things that you think should be on there, let me know what they are. But it's not a question of replacing things. It's a question of addition, not subtraction. There are far more than 16 wonderful third symphonies out there. But this happens to be a list that's limited to 16 of them. So let's see if we can do this without, causing, people to get hysterical over what is or is not there. So without further ado, you ready? Here we are. Number 1, Beethoven the Eroica. Yes! Finally, Beethoven makes the list, because I left off numbers 1 and 2 to previous lists. Why? Because I simply thought there were other more interesting works that could go on the list. Some of you may disagree, but the third, well, there's no question, right? It has to be there. It's an enormously important symphony. And so there you go. We're leading off with Beethoven, and all the Beethovenites should be happy. Next, Nielsen, Symphony number 3, the Espansiva, which was just the subject of a Dave's Fave. I also hadn't included Nielsen's first 2 symphonies, but now he's going to be appearing rather regularly, I would think, at least for the next couple. Number 3, oh yeah, Albert Roussel, the great French symphonist, his Symphony number 3, which is his most popular symphony, actually. His greatest is Symphony number 2, which appeared on the last list, but I can't leave off Symphony number 3. It's a work of genius, compact and exciting and full of energy and wonderful thematic ideas, and it should be on anybody's list of Symphonies number 3, at least if you have enough things on it. The fourth item, well, let's see, what do we got here? Oh, yes, the Portuguese composer Jolie Braga Santos, his Symphony number 3. He was really a fine composer in the Vaughan Williams school, at least for part of his career. He later moved on to other things, very interesting other things, I might add. Now, Braga Santos is a composer who has only come to our notice very, very recently because Naxos started recording his music. Had it not been for those recordings, we would not know from him. There were a couple earlier recordings of his music on some small Portuguese local labels and also on Decca. There was a version of his Third Symphony that was actually recorded by Decca, but never distributed or sold, or Decca didn't want anyone to know that it existed. There was never any effort made, and no one ever tried to follow up. But he actually created a gorgeous body of orchestral works, and they really ought to be popular. I mean, they are as fine as anything 20th century composers did. And the Third Symphony, I think, is probably his greatest. It's a beautiful, well, maybe not, but, 3, 4, and 5 are all terrific. But 3 is really, really a beautiful work, with a scherzo, which is so audibly based on that from Vaughan Williams' Pastoral Symphony that the resemblance is uncanny. But it doesn't make any difference because it's equally beautiful. Absolutely lovely. So Braga Santos is number 4. Number 5, Sibelius. Our good friend Sibelius. His Third Symphony is a milestone in the history of symphonic thought. Most people don't recognize it as such because it was done by a Finnish composer sort of outside of the mainstream of Franco-German, symphonicity, or whatever you want to call it. But it is really the first sort of neoclassical symphony before neoclassicism was a thing. It was Sibelius following his own path. Its individuality is remarkable, but it is such a fabulously put together, important, austere, granted. Yes, it is a vision of symphonicity, which is definitely on the slim and trim side of the ledger. But what a great work. And it's really Sibelius' first fully mature symphony. It doesn't have any of the questioning aspects that some might think deface numbers 1 and 2. That is, problems with coming up with a satisfying ending to the finale, and that sort of romantic, patriotic, and grandiose, lyrical impulse, which Sibelius certainly had. He definitely had it, but it wasn't necessarily what he felt was his absolute strong suit. And with the Third Symphony, we see him turning in the direction that his future music would take. And it's just a brilliant, brilliant piece of music. I love it. I just love it. Full of good tunes as well. Another number 3 from Scandinavia, Berwald, his Third Symphony, the Symphonie Singulière. One of the really most remarkable pieces of music from the period around the 1840s. That is, the end of Mendelssohn's life and when Schumann was out there. It doesn't sound like any of those people. It has a completely distinctive sonority and a completely distinctive sense of form. I mean, you've got a slow movement with a scherzo put in the middle, which is really kind of fascinating. It's in 3 movements. It's really an amazing piece, and it's full of harmonic quirks. Really interesting harmonic energy that propels the music along and gives its melodies a totally distinctive character. I think Berwald's Third belongs on any list, even short ones, of major Third symphonies. It's an extraordinary piece. Then let's see, Aaron Copland, his Third Symphony. Copland's Third, he gets a lot of guff because it is so obviously sort of, it's socialist realism goes American. It's a populist piece. It really is. It's full of big gestures and noisy climaxes and some rather screechy orchestration from high violins and piccolos screaming at the top of their range and the bass drum thudding underneath. I mean, it has a huge open sonority with a big range between what's very high and what's very low. And it contains the opening of the fanfare for the common man. And it doesn't really have a sonata form movement until the finale. Everything leading up to that is somewhat preludial. It has, which I think is a good thing. I mean, it has an interesting and unique form, which some people, spit on because it's an interesting and unique form. But that's a sign of thought. That's a positive quality most of the time. What most people object to in it is it's just open-hearted optimism and unabashed sort of jingoistic, noise and celebratory fanfare grandiosity. And, that's a matter of taste. It doesn't bother me a bit because, it is what it is. It would be one thing if it did those things and didn't do them well, but it does them very well. It really does. It's the culmination Copland's whole populist period that began with Appalachian Spring and Billy the Kid and Rodeo and all of those things. And, as such, it's part of his style and one aspect of his style. And after that, he went on to other things. So good for him. Copland's third definitely belongs on the list. Vaughan Williams, his third symphony, a pastoral symphony, not just because it seemed to really give Braga Santos something to think about, but it is an extraordinarily beautiful and powerful piece. Powerful in its, what Tovey described as massive quietness. And that's what it has. There is this sense throughout this piece, despite its very beautiful modal harmonies and folk-like themes and this wonderful fluidity of rhythm, there's this sense of just something huge underneath it, which is never really going to erupt, to the surface until perhaps the very end of the final movement, which begins with an exquisite wordless vocalese for soprano. It's so atmospheric and so evocative, but you don't ever feel the total power of the music coming to the surface, but you feel the power of the music because it's there. And that's what makes it so remarkable. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be demonstrative. It has massive quietness. Wonderful term that Tovey used. So that's really one of the major ones. And we're up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 more to go. Next, Dvorak Symphony No. 3. This is the first really unabashedly great Dvorak symphony. It's terribly underrated. It almost never gets played. It only has 3 movements, the central one of which is a very grand funeral march in the tradition of, for example, Siegfried's Funeral March or the March from Tannhäuser. It's a Dvorak's ode to Wagnerian style, but it's also full of all of those fabulous tunes that Dvorak was known for. I mean, the very opening, oh my God. Ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da. You just feel like it could go on forever. It's just this unbelievably beautiful tune. And so, I mean, the finale is zippy and delightful, almost a scherzo. Da 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 with a ting ting jingle thing. Oh, it's great. Just beautiful writing and an extraordinary piece. And it's one of the pieces that Dvorak sent off to win the Austrian State Prize. And I'm sure it's one of the symphonies, since Brahms was on the jury, that he saw and went, holy cow, there's some guy writing really good symphonies out there. What am I doing sitting on my first? Because it was shortly after Brahms' encounter with the early Dvorak symphonies, up through No. 5, that Brahms first miraculously appeared. It dropped out of his eyrie, as we call it, out of his nest, and poof, the rest is history. But I really think that the third is a gorgeous piece of music, and it ought to be more popular than it is. So if you don't know Dvorak's third, go and listen. Immediately, you're going to love it. It's glorious. Next, Saint-Saëns, his organ symphony. That's his No. 3, his official No. 3. There were a few others. He wrote 5 symphonies, and some of them have titles, and some of them have numbers, and some of them have titles. And the third is actually the last of them. It's actually the 5th. I mean, if you want to go chronologically, but it doesn't matter. He called it Symphony No. 3, and that's good enough for me. And it is one of the 2 great French symphonies of its era, the other being the Franck, D minor. But the organ symphony is sui generis. It is fabulous. What a terrific piece. Fun and original, and based on the Lisztian concept of thematic transformation from movement to movement. And everything about it is just wonderfully original, and it's sonically thrilling, and there's nothing not to love, right? And after Saint-Saëns, the Finnish composer, Levy Matatoya, one of the great Finnish composers after Sibelius. He did not write a tremendous amount of music. There are only 3 symphonies. Numbers 2 and 3 are both magnificent. They really are. But the third is probably his masterpiece. And like Sibelius's third, it's a neoclassical piece. it has more of a, in this case, a French word-leaning influence, probably, in its use of instrumental color and in its sort of perky, precise, not a note out of placeness. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece of music. I wish it were more popular. Of course, it ends quietly. It's so undemonstrative. It's really sort of a first half symphony, I think. It's not terribly long. It's about half an hour, a little less. But wow, it's full of wonderful, wonderful tunes. It's a refreshing, healthy piece of music, it seems to me. It really is. It makes you feel good once you've heard it. And I recommend it very, very strongly. There's a glorious recording of it on Ondine, and there are others as well. Madetoja was a fine composer. Again, he didn't write that much, but what he wrote, or most of what he wrote, is really very, very good. And the Third Symphony is a masterpiece, without a question, in its way. It really is. And so is his second. They're both marvelous works. So Madetoja you have to consider. And if you're wondering how to spell that or what it is, all these things are in the list, printed below this little chat. And after Madetoja, Roy Harris, Symphony No. 3. Now, this was the one that, for most of the 20th century, conservative critics sort of hauled out and said, the great American symphony, because it's based on the concept of Sibelius' Seventh, which influenced a huge number of pieces in both the UK and the US, being a single movement organism of very, very strongly cohesive bits. And the Harris Third, he was a very iffy composer. Some of his stuff is wonderful. Some of it is just note spinning, and you have to listen to it and just decide which is which. But the Third really is a great piece. It is a terrifically great piece. It's lost a lot of its luster recently. I haven't seen a performance of it in decades. I mean, people seem no longer to care. But one of the things about these cycles that we go through, where we see, some pieces are played constantly, then they disappear. Hopefully they come back if they're good. The Harris is really a good piece. It's a wonderful piece. It begins with a powerful string sort of threnody. Then there's a pastoral episode. And then there's a fugue, a wonderful fugue. There's a great subject. Bum ba ba da 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 dum, dum ba da dum, bum ba da 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 dum. Oh, it's really catchy. And then there's a sort of sorrowful, tragic, march-like, elegiac conclusion. And the end of the symphony is not a happy ending. It's a very stern ending. It has a very, very interesting sequence of emotional states. It's very effectively contrasted. It's beautifully written. It really is. And it deserves to be, let's say, rehabilitated in our consciousness, because it's definitely a great symphony. And Harris wrote other really fine pieces, not just this. But, you might, he now has the reputation of being sort of a one-shot wonder, and no one has much interest in exploring his music in any greater depth, but it deserves to be. It deserves to be. And the Third is a masterpiece, unquestionably. Then, we remember this guy. Mahler, Symphony No. 3, the longest symphony in the repertoire, the largest symphony of its kind, 6 massive movements, and with a chorus and a children's choir and all kinds of stuff going on. It is one of Mahler's cosmic creations. It's his nature poem. It begins with the Big Bang, with the explosion of nature, and then follows a Darwinian chain of being, from plants to animals to people to religion to spiritual transcendence. It's quite a piece. It really is. It's absolutely marvelous. And one of the things about the Third, the lesson we take from the Third, again, was something Tovey said. And it's worth pointing out, because I see in these talks a lot of people talk about Mahler and his grandiosity and his length. And yeah, there is a lot of length, but there's also content, and content which is commensurate with the length. It would be one thing if the length was just empty note spinning, but it isn't. It isn't. There is always a sense of form and structure and substance to Mahler's length. And, some people don't grasp that right away, or they're not interested in grasping it, which is, their problem. But Tovey said about the third, he said it was insanely long. First of all, he talks about how crazy and long it is and nuts and all that. Then he says, but the history of it shows that Mahler was exercising restraint because he so compressed its plan that he extruded one item. He took out one item and saved it for the finale of the Fourth Symphony. That's the song, Das himmlische Leben, the heavenly life. That became the finale of the third. Originally, there were 7 movements, not 6. So Mahler's, crazy designs have a lot of thought and balancing behind them, even in this symphony. And that's always worth thinking about, especially for those who are quick to accuse him of megalomania, because that's not really quite what's going on there. There's another story, and if your whole life's work is going to consist basically of 42 songs and a few symphonies, then you have to pack as much as you can into each one, and you have to take all of these cases as they come. So after Mahler, we have Brahms third. There you go. I hope you're all happy again, because we did, of course, do Brahms first. I left out the second. The reason I left out the second, the reason I don't include all the Brahms symphonies, is because they're all rather similar. I mean, they are. Brahms had a very definite conception of what a symphony should be. And, of course, they're not identical, but they are all of a certain style. And if you know a couple, you're in pretty good shape to go off on your own and do the others. And I would rather include other pieces than these overly familiar sort of, war horses. But that's okay, because the third really is in many ways Brahms' greatest symphony. It's, I think, formally his most original, his most unique. And it's an extraordinary piece. It really is. And it's the one that's most often played badly. And so I recommend that you go have a look at my videos on Brahms' third, and also the relationship between Brahms' third and Dvorak's fifth, which was its proximate inspiration, in my view. It's a very, very interesting story, but the Brahms third is a fascinating piece and should be on anybody's short list of third symphonies. After Brahms, we only have 2 more. Alberic Magnard, Symphony No. 3. Now we're getting into the Magnardiisms. Magnard was a wonderful composer. He wrote 4 symphonies. He was blown up by the Germans defending his property from invading forces all by himself, which wasn't a very smart idea, during World War I. And his third symphony is the first Magnard symphony of which most people will become aware. And the reason is because Ansermet made a recording for Decca, which Decca actually wasn't too ashamed of. They could have coupled it with the Braga Santos third symphony, and then maybe Braga Santos would have been better known. Magnard wasn't exactly pushed like crazy either. He wasn't, but Ansermet did it, thank God, and for that reason, at least one of his major symphonies was preserved for posterity on disc, which gave us a toehold into listening to the rest of them, because they really are great works. And he was a very serious composer. Oh my goodness. He would give the Germans a run for their money in symphonic seriousness. He really would. But boy, this is a beautiful work. It has a gorgeous modal chorale opening that operates as its motto theme, because all of these French symphonies are written in the school of Franck. That is, they have recurring ideas or unifying mottos between movements. But Magnard is a fabulous symphonist, and you should know his third, without a doubt. However, I only have room for one more, and we get to 16. And that one more is Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony. Now, I just did a repertoire talk on the Scottish Symphony, and so I don't really need to go through that again, except to say that the Mendelssohn Scottish Symphony is the most underrated symphony of the 19th century. It is so hugely influential and such a masterwork. It has so many things to say about symphonic construction. It transforms themes from movement to movement, from the first movement to the scherzo and then to the finale. It has just an amazing amount of atmosphere. There's something vaguely programmatic about some of it. There's a storm in the first movement. Mendelssohn doesn't tell us what it is, but it's a storm. Trust me when I tell you, it's gorgeously scored. It's full of wonderful tunes. It has a controversial finale because it does a total sort of major key transformation motto thing that it does. It does it quite successfully in my view, but some people think that that ending is tacked on. But Tchaikovsky obviously didn't think so when he came to write his Fifth Symphony. And he does exactly the same thing. And the best is that that wonderful heroic ending has the brass going ba-dum, 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 da-dum, da-da, da-dum, which is glorious. And Sullivan, who I just did a talk about, stole it for that fabulous scene with Major General Stanley and the policemen in Act 2 of The Pirates of Penzance, when they're going, away, away, yes, yes, we go. These pirates slay, yes, yes, we go. Then do not stay, tarantara. Then why this delay, tarantara. Oh, yes, we go. Yes, forward to the foe. Yes, but you don't go. It's hilariously funny, and it's the entire ending of Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony, transmogrified into the realm of comic opera. That's just, I mean, that's how important this symphony was. One of the absolute giveaways when a great piece of music shows up somewhere as an epic event is its importance is determined by the extent to which someone can parody it and be immediately understood. You know, there's the object of what you're making fun of. So the Mendelssohn Scottish Symphony is the last, but certainly not least, of my 16 symphonies number 3. Go forth and listen, my friends, and keep on listening. Thanks for joining me. Take care.